Just want to welcome you to our study as we continue our series in The Bible Has, we have questions, the Bible has answers. I just want to welcome you if you're watching or if you're here. We're continuing our series as part 2 of the question, which is on the other board, which you'll see eventually in the video. What Bible translation should you read? So we're talking about different translations, translation theory, the differences between the more literal or formal translations and the more thought for thought or paraphrasing, more of the dynamic equivalent. We'll get to that chart. Will get to that after me. Talking about the differences. What Bible translation should we read? It feels like hundreds of English translations. Which should we choose? Should we choose a different one for study versus just leisurely reading the Bible or enjoying reading the Bible? Or should we, what should we do there? Which is the best one? There's so many options. So Will wanted me to just kind of briefly, I'm going to try to be as brief as I can and as simple as I can, briefly talk about translation. And I just want to, just as a, just to say, like, I'm not a Bible translator, and I'm not a Greek or Hebrew scholar by any means. I just have more background in this, took classes in it, and so I know enough to just kind of give you the basics of how they translate, the decisions that they have to make, and how we get from the Greek or Hebrew to the English. It'll be more Greek tonight. But it's not just an A to B kind of simple task, as words, phrases, grammar, culture, cultural phrases, idioms, all play a role. And we're different in the first century. In first century Koine Greek, which was kind of the common Greek of the day, that's what the New Testament is written in, versus 21st century English. So we're trying to transcend a 2,000-year gap. So the translators are trying to be most faithful to the text, the meaning of the text, and they're trying to bridge that 2,000-year gap from Koine Greek all the way to modern American English, which even that, regionally can differ, right? And if you're in the South, if you're out west, if you're up north, there's different little phrases. I know some people at the church here are from California. I'll say things, because I grew up here in the South, I'll just say things. I'll be like, man, that dog will hunt. And they'll be like, what? What's going to hunt? Just things like that. It's different, right? And they're like, what does that mean? It's just a phrase. They may have phrases that they say, and I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And so even like, I had an inspection about a month ago with a couple of English ladies, like from England. They speak the same language, but it's very different. They called I don't want to necessarily bring it up, but when I do inspections, I check to see if the toilet is loose. And I told her she had a loose toilet, and she called it a loo. And I was like, what's a loo? I had no idea. Like, that's just what they call it. They call it something differently. So you see the differences even in English. And so you have to think about all that when you're translating from an ancient language that's no longer spoken into a modern 21st century English language. And so this was really helpful. Bill Mounts is a really good resource. Got to give him credit. He's a really famous Greek scholar. He writes a lot of the introductory grammars that you would use if you wanted to learn Greek. He's got some really good stuff. And he's also a translator on Bible Translation Committee. So this was a really helpful quote that he had. He says, translation is the process by which we reproduce the meaning of the text. Translation does not reproduce the form of the text. And so this is important. Remember this. And the key is really translation does not reproduce the form of the text. It's trying to get to the heart, to the meaning of what the text means in the original languages. So Greek is a very different language than English. Koine Greek. So Greek is not based on word order. So we're just going to do some simple English grammar here. Greek is not based on word order. It's based on cases. It's based on what case the word is in. So there's 4 cases in Greek. There's the nominative, the genitive, the dative, and the accusative. Okay, so the nominative will be the case of subject. So when you look at a sentence written in Greek, the nominative is the subject of the sentence. This would be the subject. This is John 3:16. This is basically what you would see in an interlinear Bible. You got the Greek here and the English, very literal English below it. That's the nominative. So God is the subject of John 3:16. It's in the nominative case. Genitive is like the possessive case. So like in this English sentence, Will's paddle, pickleball paddle, right? It's Will's paddle. Will possesses the paddle. So that's the case of possession. So in this sentence, it would be the son of him. So it would be, well, that's not the construction in this particular verse, so that may not be the best example. But genitive is the possessive case. The dative case in Greek is the indirect object. And then in the accusative, it is the direct object. So to illustrate in English, simple English sentence, figured I would throw in some pickleball, give some love to pickleball here, and to David. I hit the pickleball with Will's paddle to David, okay? So I is the subject, hit is the verb, the direct object, what's being hit, the pickleball, with Will's paddle, or you could say the paddle of Will, or the paddle of him, is another construction, but that's the possessive noun, and then to David, indirect object. Okay, so in Greek, this could be written any way. Like, the verb could be at the very end. You'd be reading it literally, and then all of a sudden you'd get the verb way over here. And there's many different ways you can construct it to emphasize certain things, to emphasize what the author wants to emphasize. So, like I said, I mean, in Greek, this sentence could just be written anyway. It's not based on word order like English. It's based on case. Okay, so I thought a good way to illustrate this would just be writing John 3:16. Everybody knows John 3:16. This is John 3:16 in Greek. And when talking about translation, formal equivalence versus dynamic equivalence. Formal being the more word-for-word, literal translation versus the dynamic, which would be the thought for thought or precept for precept or paraphrase. This is the difference. This is what literally how you read it if you did it like as literal as you can read it. And you see that this would not be great English and it wouldn't really make a lot of sense and we would never read an English translation like this. So literally it would read this. Or do I need to stay over here, I guess? Thus, for he loved the God, the world, that the Son, the only, he gave so that all the ones who believe to him not perish, but may have life eternal. And so that's just not how we would say it in English. That's just very, very choppy, and it's not good English. It's difficult to understand. And so a more literal translation would be more, I mean, it would be closer to this, but just in a way that we can understand it, like the New American Standard Bible, the ESV, but you get like to the New Living Translation, things like that, they're going to draw out more of the meaning of the words and interpret it for you and really smooth it out even more. Not that the ESV and the NASB aren't smooth, it's just those along that scale of translation will be a little more readable, but not quite as literal, if that makes sense. Okay. Yeah. Yes. And so I don't want to go too long here. I want to give Will his time. This is just an example of translation, really simple. Just quickly, just to give a few more examples, like idioms, some Greek idioms that we wouldn't necessarily, if we translated it literally, we may understand what it means, but it's just harder to understand for the average person. Matthew 26:43, if you literally translate that, it's talking about the disciples falling asleep with Jesus in the garden. It says their eyes were weighed down. Now, some people may be like, their eyes were weighed down. Well, they're asleep. They couldn't stay awake. Matthew 1:18, to have in the womb is an idiom for pregnancy. Genesis 15. This is more along the Hebrew side, but the Hebrew word for karat is used when God makes a covenant with Abraham. It says God made a covenant with Abraham, but literally that term means to cut. So he cut a covenant. Now, what does that mean? I mean, most people are like, what do you mean he cut what? He cut a covenant. Well, literally, if you read the story, the way they made a covenant in the ancient Near East is they cut the animals in half, and then the Lord passed through the pieces, showing that this is what will happen to me if I don't keep my covenant and my promises to you. So it was like a self-maledictory oath that the Lord gave to Abraham. I will be faithful to my promise and to my covenant. And so then it makes sense now. To cut a covenant means that's literally what they did when they made a covenant in the ancient Near East. Just doing like interpreting lexically, which would be like doing word studies. Here's just an example, and I thought this was really helpful. This is also from a book from Bill Mounts. Just how many different meanings one word can have, like in the English language. He uses the word key as an example. So key, you could say, did you lose your key? What is the key to the puzzle? What is the key point? What key is that song in? Like when I play on Sunday, what key is that song in? Press the A key. He shoots best from the key. That's talking about basketball. I first ate key lime pie in Key West in the Florida Keys. And so that one word can have all of those different meanings. So how do you know what the author is intending when he's writing? Well, a lot of it has to do with context, how it's used elsewhere. But just a couple of examples from the Greek text. 1 John 2:2, hilasmos is the Greek word for propitiation. So here's like a difference of these different translations. So a literal translation is going to use the word propitiation. And that's a big theological word. Now, I think Christians should know it because it's in the text. I mean, it's in the Bible. That's a Bible word. Like, we should use those words, sanctification, justification. Those shouldn't be scary to us. We should learn what they mean because they're rich in meaning. They really contribute to our sanctification, to our walk with Christ. But that word literally means like wrath absorber, or that which atones for sins, right? And so in those literal translations, they just leave it literal as it's translated, propitiation. But the more like thought for thought translations, they go ahead and translate the meaning of the word for you in the translation. And they say that which atones for sins, or that which satisfies the wrath of God. And so you don't have to do quite as much work in like looking that word up, which I'm very confident Will is going to say is why those translations, the more thought for thought, are okay. They're great for reading, not necessarily for studying and preaching, because you want to be able to you want to have to be able to dig. Like you want that. Like you want to have to do the work because that helps you grow in your understanding of God's Word. Another one would just be like, for example, sarx in Greek means flesh. So when Paul uses the term flesh, flesh can mean a lot of things. In Greek, flesh can mean like my skin, my muscles, my flesh. Or it could also mean like the brokenness that we have as people as being a depraved human race. When Paul says that we should walk by the Spirit and not by the flesh in Galatians, is he talking about walking by the Spirit and not by your skin or your muscles or your bones? No, he's saying walk by the Spirit, not by the sinfulness that is in you because you are depraved and you are dead in your trespasses and sins from birth. And so you see the difference there. And then I'll just end with this. This has been a really hotly debated translation as far as the word arsenokoites, which means we would say homosexual, or men who practice homosexuality, or just people who practice homosexuality. But here's the difference in some of these translations. I'm sure Will will draw this out too. But 1 Timothy 1:10, different translations. The CEV translates arsenokoites, live as homosexuals. ESV, men who practice homosexuality. That's much more general, right? And sweeping. The NCV, who have sexual relations with people of the same sex. Practicing homosexuals would be the NET. So as long as you're not practicing, NLT says practice homosexuality. That's a little stronger. But there's some newer translations, even now, like the newer updated Revised Standard Version, even goes as far as to interpret that and translate that as men who engage in illicit sexual activity. So only men who engage in that. As long as you don't do that, then you're fine. Which, again, is an interpretation that is not faithful to, I mean, it shows like where the continuum is on that translation, that they're trying to kind of read into that translation. And so to fit their own theological framework, right? And so those are just examples of translation and translations and the decisions they have to make when they translate. And so are there any questions, or did that make sense? I mean, there's a lot more that we could talk about, but this is just kind of an introduction into what he's going to talk about. Yeah, there are translations. Will's going to talk to you about translations to avoid. There, like the New World Translation would be like the Jehovah's Witness translation, and they, I think it was translated by like 5 Greek scholars, which they choose their own. And I mean, most modern translations have 70 to 100 scholars that are on the committee. Yeah. So they don't practice, especially on the text that talk about the divinity of Christ. They just kind of throw common Greek grammar rules to the side in order to fit their own Christology about who Christ is, because they would say he's not the second person of the Trinity, that he's a created being. We could go into that. I mean, we could do a couple hours on this, but.
So you explain Greek in this case as like an antiquity or koinia, is that what you?
Koine. Koine.
So, I mean, obviously Greek is spoken today.
Yes.
So is that kind of equate like Old English from England, like you were saying, compared to modern English, or I mean, English was different.
Yeah. I mean, I guess you could say that. Yeah.
Shakespeare was writing or whatever.
Yeah.
You know what I mean, kind of thing. So.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a dead language. Like nobody speaks Koine Greek, but but Greek is still obviously spoken. But yeah, it's just going to be a lot different. Like the rules and
Things like that.
yeah.
But do those 4 parts of speech still exist in Greek today? Is that still?
I'm not sure. I've never. I've never. Yeah.
It's just really interesting that.
Yeah. Yeah, I've never studied modern Greek.
Okay.
But like for instance, just a quick example. Like you got your subject here, for God, and then you got your verb here. That's from agape, and it's in the third person singular. He loves. So for God loves the world. That's the direct object. That the Son. So the verb's all the way down here. You got to go that He gave the Son. Okay, and then you have the adverb monogene, His only Son. So that those who believe, that's a participle, so those who believe in Him, that's the negative in Greek, may, not perish, but have is the verb, but have eternal life. And this is pretty simple, like Greek, John, and there's some like Luke and those guys. Luke was a doctor, so Luke, it is, yeah. Luke is harder, more formal. Yes, harder to read. Hebrews is hard to read. Yeah, it's hard. That's like the hardest. Yeah.
Josh, reference the fact that we have English words that are inserted that are not in the original.
Yeah. We have to insert words to smooth it out in English. So it's not like we're adding to the text. It's just we have to put words. Like if you. Yeah, like if I write out, I'll have on here Philippians 1:21. It says, kai emoi, for me to live. It's got the infinitive, to live, and then it just says Christ. And then and to die, and then it just has gain. The is not even in there. It's just understood. So you have to insert that in English. For me to live, Christ, to die, gain. If you did it in English, like straight up, it would be for to me to live Christ, to die, gain. But we put is to smooth it out because we just don't talk like that. Another one, just an idiom, this is a Hebrew idiom, is, talking about the patience of the Lord, the long suffering of God. In the Hebrew, it literally means like that he has a long nose, like the Lord has a long nose. Well, that's weird to us, or it is to me, like the Lord has a long nose. Well, that was just an expression they would use to say the Lord is patient, he's long suffering, he's compassionate. Me and Will were talking today about just words that we say, or when I first got married, Anna asked me one time, she was like, how much do you like? And I was like what? Like, how much do you like? And I was like, I don't know what that means. And she was like, how much do you lack? It's like a southern, I guess, way of saying how much do you have left, or how much do you lack? She's like, why can't you just say how much do you lack? But it's just a saying, like, how much do you like? And there's all kind of things that we say that if you tried to translate that, let's say we tried to translate that back into Greek or like another modern language, you'd have to translate it into Spanish. Like the interpreter would have to think of a way to say that they could understand, what we're trying to say. So really interesting stuff. So that's just kind of a intro to what Will's going to talk about, which he's going to address the question, like, what translation should we read? Which ones are the most faithful to the original? Which ones aren't? Which ones should we avoid? And so I'll call Will up here to do his section.
Thank you, CJ. All right, guys, we kind of tag teamed tonight. Is that good, David? Is that good? We kind of tag teamed this night. I just thought that if we would use our resident Greek scholar over here, that we could just kind of get some information. And y'all, what Josh is explaining is like when you translate from the original language, there are things and rules that have to be installed in order for a person that's just an average Joe reading the text to understand it. So it makes sense that we have to add stuff. So when somebody goes, we read Revelation at the very end, do not add or take away anything from this, right? We understand that, but in translating, you're not taking away any of the redemptive story. You're just simply going, how would this make sense? How could I go minister to somebody on the street, and if you read John 3:16, if he just said, thus for he loved the God, the world, that the Son only, they'd be like, man, you need to go get a drug test. Because they would just be like, this guy's having a mental breakdown. So it's not, there are thousands of languages that we have Greek and Hebrew translated into. So what happens is we want people to understand the story. Now, I will say this, prior to us taking the journey last week, which was a pretty extensive track through how we got the Bible, like thinking about it, before they had the written Word of God, like all we know is this. People, y'all probably have them on your Bible on your phone. You have all this information. Think about this. Before all of that is put into a book and printed, before the Gutenberg press, or before the Tyndale or the Wycliffe Bible that has been written down by hand and passed out, it's just, a lot of this stuff is oral. You're meeting somebody, just sharing the gospel with them. And you can share the Word of God without actually having it in the text. You can share the good news of that. That's what he's doing his whole ministry. So, but we have gotten this, and so this needs to be where we land and we go to. I cannot preach from a Spanish Bible. I can't preach from a German Bible. I can't do it. It would make no sense to me or anybody in here. So Matthew 24:35 says this, and we've been reading this kind of every week just to kind of reiterate this. Heaven and earth, Jesus says, will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Matthew 24:35. So God has, in His sovereignty and providence, preserved the Word so that we can have it this day. 2,000 plus years later, Andrew, Will, Josh, Lori, CJ, David, we can literally pick up a Bible and we can read what Jesus did 2,000 plus years ago for sinners. Like it really is remarkable that we've just taken the journey and that we have all of these translations. So the KJV, as we kind of took our journey through all the Old Testament, the New Testament, and then kind of how we got our English translation, and we kind of ended with the KJV being really in 1611 the standard English translation of the time, and we said that it reigned from 1611 to 1880, 269 years. it kind of was the standard for English translations. Now, obviously, as Josh said earlier, languages evolve. So when somebody the other day was like, I can't read Old English. So Old English that's not really a good, I mean, what you read in the KJV is almost what they called like Elizabethan English a little bit. And so there was a study done, I read this the other day, a study was done where there is not a single person known on the planet that is still alive that speaks that way. So naturally, if nobody speaks like that, then unless they're in some play, if nobody's speaking like that on common language, then it would be beneficial for people to speak and say a word, especially if a word in the KJV could simply just be changed and there be no meaning changed in the text, just simply it's clear for you and I today. So you can understand, like this causes, in the academic world, in the school world, this causes a ton of fights. I mean, like you get two Bible scholars or two people like, yo, I'll wrestle you about that text. Like they really get worked up about it. I mean, and here's ultimately in Josh's Hebrew class, or Greek class in college, and if I'm not mistaken, Josh, you guys had to take a section and really, did y'all do your own translation? Like you had to, they made their own translation out of the text. But here's the deal, if they're following the rules correctly and they're taking it within context, then Josh could in essence get a group of 100 scholars with him to check work and research, and they could literally make a translation. And it wouldn't be unbiblical necessarily to do that. But most people go, I had this Bible since I was 7 years old, it's all I know. And I get that, because most people, to be honest, don't care, nor will they ever pursue Greek and Hebrew or like ancient word study, so they're not looking at that. So there again, if you don't do that, then you must make sure that you are sitting under somebody that is going to preach faithfully from the text. And if not, that's a problem. So how many English translations do you guys think that we have right now? English translation Bibles. How many do you think? Josh said, what'd you say, Josh? A couple hundred maybe, or whatever? You said that earlier. I don't know if you just knew, but how many do you think? I'm going to say 350, okay.
I would only guess like,
Okay.
have any idea there are that many.
Josh, what do you think? Okay, that's a good number. David? Okay. There are 900 English translations. That is from Tyndale and Wycliffe all the way to 2024. Roughly 900 translations. So, like, and some of these are like offshoots of stuff. And so, two different sources claim that. And I was like, that is ridiculously crazy. So, it's just anybody can throw a translation out there. But, are they credible? Do they have an agenda when they're doing it? And obviously, we don't read from all of these necessarily English translations. So the question becomes, why so many translations? Well, ultimately, I think the question becomes, like, the simple answer to that is languages change and they evolve over time. Now, I'm not just talking about English translations. That's just in the English translation. But I'm talking just continually, like, as languages evolve, translations evolve to adapt to that. Now, the struggle is, hey, you're getting to thought for thought. You're getting to trying to extract more meaning out of it than what actually is in the Greek. Because that translation, John 3:16, when we put that kind of together and we read, for God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever shall believe in Him shall not perish but have eternal life. When we write that, that's not that too far. In most translations, there's some translations where you read, you're like, oh yeah, almost 6 or 15 or 20 of them are pretty much the same for this. But when you kind of get into some of the more complex Greek or complex Hebrew or some of the things that maybe, to be honest, culturally have started to push and shift on those scholars, you might get some stuff where in 1 Corinthians 6, they translated men who practice illicit sex rather than just homosexuals. That's a huge difference, right? Because if you're saying it's okay to be homosexual, it's not okay to practice illicit sex, unconsensual, paid-for sex, or something crazy, they would be referencing that's wrong, but not just homosexuality in a monogamous, loving relationship, because that's what's going on culturally. Does that make sense? So we are mindful of the culture when we pick a translation, because it needs to be understandable and readable or the word would be formal, as opposed to dynamic, where it's like, hey, we're just going to kind of let this flow a little bit more. So not that those translations are bad when you have thought-for-thought translations, or even every once in a while reading a paraphrase, but be mindful that they are taking the word and they are kind of, okay, this is kind of the meaning of this, or this is where we kind of land on it. So we want to be real careful about that. So, but ultimately, we want more translations so that we can give translations out to people that speak different languages. We want to do that. That's why we support Wycliffe Bible Translators, because we think that they're doing a great job. And they are very careful, if you'll read their stuff on their website, they're very careful to maintain the close to the word-for-word translation when they translate it. So when I was in Romania doing some mission work in college, I can remember that there was a certain group of Romanians that lived in Timișoara was the city, and kind of their dialect was a little different than what they would speak in Bucharest, the capital city, and so they really didn't have a word for resurrection. They just didn't really have a word for that, so we were having to go, how do we explain to them resurrection or propitiation? What does it mean that God absorbs the wrath, that Jesus absorbs the wrath of God for us? God, what does that mean? So we had to kind of try to figure out a way to kind of explain it to these people that really weren't understanding, well, what does resurrection mean? There's a word for that, but it's not the word that we use. So we have to be careful. So there are 3 categories of Bibles in general, 3 categories. We have word-for-word translations, word-for-word, thought-for-thought, and then we have paraphrase. Now, word-for-word, I'm going to kind of read you some definitions I have. A word-for-word Bible translation, and if you guys have the chart, you can kind of see the spectrum on there. Word-for-word Bible translation is a Bible that aims to hew as closely as possible to the wording and grammatical structure of the original text. The more technical word is Josh used it, formal. It is a formal translation. Now, obviously, what Mounts is saying is translation is the process by which we reproduce the meaning of the text. Like we're not coming up with a different meaning, but we're trying to go, here's what the text says, how do we reproduce that as mirrored as closely as we can without taking away from what the text actually says or redefining something. All of that would be dangerous. So, word for word, whenever possible, a word-for-word translation tries to translate each word, phrase, and concept in the original text with an exactly matching word, phrase, and concept in the target language. That's the goal, which is why Bible translations to other countries are so difficult, right? You're going into a country, you're learning the language of this small group of people and going, okay, how do we explain it to them clearly? How do we make the concept of what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians, how do we make that make sense to them clearly where they would be able to understand it? It would just be difficult, right? If CJ mentioned Spanish, if we had a Spanish sentence or paragraph and you translated it word for word in English, wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. Now, you may could spend some time and figure it out and sort them, but it just wouldn't make much sense. So, people sometimes call this kind of Bible a literal translation. You may have heard us say, maybe on Sunday, we're talking about, okay, a literal translation of this phrase, this word is this. When we say that, we're just going, that's the exact definition, but you couldn't really write that in the text. It would be difficult to do that, to just go write the literal definition. And I would say this too, without sounding any bit whatever from the Word of God, y'all, we do not have like an actual literal word for like that. That's just really not a thing. It would not make any sense, really. So the aim for word translation is they aim to reduce, this is important, they aim to reduce the human interpretation factor in Bible translation. If you took our How to Study the Bible class, one of the first things we talk about is leaving baggage at the door when you step into the text. My experiences, this is what I felt, I saw this one time. That's all irrelevant when we come to the text to go, what does the Bible say? Our feelings, our experiences are translated through the Scriptures in the right context, in the right order, based on the whole explosive look at the Bible. So, they aim to reduce the human interpretation, which is like when you go to the paraphrase, like the Message Bible, that's exactly what he's doing. He's going, I've read the text, here's what this means to me. That's what he's doing. That's just what he's saying. It's almost like a commentary. I'm even kind of just whatever to even call it a Bible translation. Although Eugene Peterson, to his credit, knows Greek and Hebrew. He does know, he does know the language. He studied it. It's just he's going, well, how can I say this in a way that just makes really, really, really clear sense? So he's polishing it a ton and then going, let me explain it. And I'll read a text for you in a second and show you all three. Word for word, the aim, the goal is to be aimed at, but can never ultimately be completely achieved. Josh, would that be a good way to say it? We're aiming for it, but it's never completely word for word achieved. It just can't be, because it's not going to make any sense. With our rules in English, it wouldn't make no sense to everybody, as you saw when he explained it. So, thought for thought, word for word, thought for thought would be, and this is what they call also functional or dynamic translations. And you can look on your chart and kind of see those, and there's a few examples here. They aim to reproduce the original text using more modern language to communicate the broader meaning of the text. So it's not quite a word for word, more literal, formal. Dynamic means we're going to really make this readable. Their goal is not to take away from the text, but it's also to make it very readable and understandable so that you can just kind of like, pick it up and just go, yeah, okay, I can kind of see what that is. So they prioritize the readability over the literal translation and almost kind of like provide like an easy-to-read scripture for people. And typically I would even say this, if you read from the New Living or the NIV, if you just picked one of those up, if you pick the NLT up and then you pick the ESV up, you would see a dramatic difference in the language. It's a little bit easier read, right? If you're reading to your little kids, it may be like, oh yeah, this is a lot easier for them to kind of pick up at an early age. No doubt about that. Or if you're a brand new Christian, there's a guy I met, he was a brand new believer. He's like, man, I know nothing about the Bible. I don't read at a very high level. And I was like, man, the New Living would be a really helpful, like something for you to understand the story. Like 100%, no doubt about that. So I'm not sliding those things, but most people that are hammering, like I would never read anything but an NASB or an ESV, or even a KJV, I would never read anything that wasn't on that line. I think that they probably either just grew up hearing that, or they're just at a place to where they understand words, they understand definitions, especially if you're not in a place that you can be discipled and stuff can be fleshed out and explained to you. That's dangerous. If you're just at a place picking up going, I have no idea what I'm reading, it is not helpful if you don't understand it. So like the NIV is written more on, golly, man, more like a 6th or 7th grade reading level. Like it's very understandable, whereas the ESV and NASB is more like 10th, 11th, 12th. It's just the way that it's written. So no knock on those as far as that is. That was intentional by the scholars. These guys said, we want to make it very readable. Like that was the intention. So it's not that they weren't just like, we're just trying to be loose and flat with the word. They're going, we feel, if you talk to these guys, I've seen interviews with them on both groups, they're like, our aim was to make a very readable thing. They're like, we have people all throughout the U.S. that just have never graduated high school. And if they're not under a good discipling pastor, we want them to be able to pick the book up on the side of the road and just simply be able to read the scriptures. Like that would be very helpful. So thought for thought, word for word, thought for thought, paraphrase. A paraphrase is more of like a commentary on the text of Scripture. And so that is an accurate rendering of what the text actually says. So, and you could, accurate, that could be kind of used loosely, the definition that kind of the Bible Gateway gives. But they take a passage of the text and they kind of go, okay, what does this mean? Let's just kind of flesh that out. And really what they're doing is they're interpreting whatever's written. Now, most of the time, especially with the Message, with Eugene Peterson, one guy did the translation or the paraphrase, one guy. So as opposed to the NIV that's having a ton of scholars, or the ESV that had 120 guys on the team, that's totally different because you're checking work and checking this and making sure that everybody is on the right page as far as the translation, and even different denominations to go, are we clear that this means this? Yes, we are, looking at all of the Old Text, looking at the Textus Receptus, looking at the Byzantine or the Constantinopolitan text, looking at any other text that we have, the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're pulling all of that and going, is this the clearest way that we can say it while making it as close to the word for word as we can get? That's That's what they were doing, which is a paraphrase is kind of not doing that. Now, I will say this, Eugene Peterson, he never claims that this was like a Bible that you should preach from. It was like, I wrote this so that people could understand the Scriptures better, that they could be flushed out. So his intention, I think, was okay. It is not something that we would preach from. It is not something that we would teach from or recommend that you do that. So let's look at the Bible translation chart right quick. You guys have one right there? Little flippity flip. And so I kind of put it on the board as well. So when you look at this kind of spectrum, we have, like we said, word for word, thought for thought, paraphrase. In the word for word, like furthest down the line, is the NASB, the New American Standard Bible, as well as the Amplified Bible, as well as the ESV Bible, and in that paradigm is the KJV and the New King James Version. These translations are going to be the most literal that they're able to get while still maintaining an element of readability to the text. So that's what they're going to be doing, okay? Now, we preach, Josh and I preach from the ESV, okay? The ESV is, in my mind, and we moved over, I had an NIV for probably my first year of college, and then I discovered the ESV, and I was like, man, this is really good. And I had several guys just explain to me the process of the translation, how it went down, and I was like, this to me, to Will, and I'm not saying you only should read from this, but it's what we have in the pews because it's what we teach from, but it is the most literal translation that also provides the most readable text that I have found. It maintains like integrity in the translation as well as being able to be read and understood by, I think, because a lot of people here use it, to understood by most people. I think it's a very good translation. So NASB, if you read an NASB, New American Standard Bible, it is pretty, I'm not even want to say the word choppy, but is a lot of large words in the New American Standard Bible. And if you just read a few texts in the NASB, you'll see that. The Amplified Bible, kind of on the more word for word, it's a cool Bible as well. The thing about the Amplified is if you pick up an Amplified Bible and you look in it, when you're reading, it'll have the text, and it's trying to be word for word, but then it'll have, like, throughout, if you just look up anything in the Amplified, it has brackets, like, all throughout the Bible, and basically, it's translating it word for word, but then it's throwing in almost thought for thought in the brackets. So it's kind of a neat, in my mind, it's kind of a neat study tool if you have an Amplified Bible. So they tried to kind of do both in one, which wasn't necessarily unhelpful, but just be mindful of that too. And granted, y'all, I have not read through every single one of these translations fully, so I'm just giving you kind of drone shot views. So KJV, more word for word. Obviously, the KJV and the New King James used only in their translation the Textus Receptus, which is what they had in 1611. So both of these, the New King James, you've read that, very difficult to understand. The New King James Version is more modern English, but only used the Textus Receptus, which means that they were only using what they had in 1611, and all of the translations, all the copies of the older translations that we got like in the mid-1800s, those were all better translations, but the New King James refused to use them because they were like, we're just going to use like what the KJV wrote. But with that said, y'all, this is still a very good, the New King James is still a very good word-for-word translation. It takes away nothing from the text, so if you want to use that, then rock on with it. Most people here, when I'm preaching, they'll just kind of either, if they don't have an ESV, they'll grab that one or they'll pull one up on their phone, just so that what? They're reading the same thing. That's why they do it. So I don't plan on changing that at all. I don't plan on changing from the ESV. I think it's a great translation. And so as you kind of move further down into word for word, thought for thought, the Holman Christian Standard Bible, that has become a really popular Bible. And it's not quite all the way thought for thought. It's kind of in between. The goal for that was to make it very readable. Then you put the New American Bible as well, the NAB, a more thought for thought Bible. And then even toward kind of not the center of thought for thought, but a little to the right, we have the NIV, which the NIV was very popular for so long. NIV was super popular. Let me see, NIV, 1978 it came out. There was updates in 84, and in 2011. So there have been some updates to the NIV. There again, that was the first Bible I ever had. First Bible I ever had, my grandma bought me NIV, and I was like, cool. So I just read it. It was pretty easy to read. I could understand it. We had a professor in college that helped with the Old Testament translation on some of the NIV teams. So that was kind of neat. So he was obviously very much a pro NIV fan. He would actually say, he said this in class one time, he said the NIV, the Old Testament, is much better translated than the New Testament. He just felt that the Old Testament Hebrew, the scholars, the guys they had were locked in tight. So the NIV Old Testament, very locked in tight. He said the New Testament, they kind of tried to be a little bit more that thought for thought, which kind of gets into, well, let me just explain the word. So instead of using a word like propitiation, they go, the wrath of God that was absorbed for you, like kind of things, which not necessarily is wrong to say. It's just they're taking that Greek word and going, let me pull out a whole sentence to explain it, which is, like I said, not bad at all. I don't think that anything's lost when you read this. We have the TNIV, which is a little bit further down the thought for thought. I do take some issues with the TNIV, which is today's New International Version. And then we have the New Living Translation. As I said, that's kind of thought for thought, getting down there. It's a very easy read if you have a New Living Translation. Stephanie loves to leisurely read through stories of Scripture and books of the Bible, kind of using a more word for word, but also kind of using this almost to read them almost parallel, if that makes sense. So these are necessarily not all bad from like a study standpoint. And then you kind of move on down to some of these translations. You have the NI, some of these you probably never heard of, the New International Reader's Version, which is the NIRV. You have the GNT, which is the Good News Translation. And so now you're starting to get to a paraphrase where they have moved away from the literal translation, and now they've kind of moved down toward, let me kind of flesh this out, and here's kind of what my thoughts are on it. So we need to be careful. As we get, I mean, I would even probably just caution you, man, and I'm going to make a statement about the NIV in a second, but once you kind of get kind of in this area, I would just be real mindful and just careful and cautious as I read them, that there's a ton of the scholar's thoughts floating into the translation. And then once you kind of get over here, you almost don't have, it is a Bible translation because they're looking at the original, but it's almost like commentary-like because they're explaining what they feel that it means. Now, there may be 30 guys that agree on that, but be mindful. And then all the way over here, you have the TLB, which is the Living Bible, which is very much a paraphrase, and then the Message, which is kind of the standard for paraphrase by Eugene Peterson. So, y'all, I know churches that the pastor preaches, I mean, he preaches from the Message. I know two guys that are, well, were local, but last several years, they would just get up and like the Message is on the thing, and they're reading straight from it. I think that is horrifically a problem because there are, and we could walk through some of the text in the Message that just like, you can for sure tell that he is implying something that he feels rather than what the text says, which we want to be very, very cautious about that for sure. The New American Standard, y'all, I would highly recommend from like a teaching standpoint. The NASB is a really good translation, but probably the most recommended. And I'm biased toward it, but the ESV is a really good, if you're like, well, what do I need to get? If you don't understand, get an ESV study Bible. Those are excellent and great to read from. You may have preferences that you just like, and that's okay. And some people go, well, I've read this same Bible for 20 years. I memorized scripture in it. I've memorized verses in it. Praise the Lord if you do that. I would like to say, though, I just like doing that. I would like to say that if you're in this bracket area over here, and there are translations I don't have on here, but if you're in this bracketed area, use this for study, reading. Let me kind of understand that. But I would love for people to move toward, as they grow in their faith and sanctification and edification, to read more of a word for word translation. I think there's so much more richness in the text. Josh, you would probably agree with that we would want to dig deep in those things too. If you're a brand new person, you're like, hey man, I'm just trying to figure out what this means, then obviously the Bible is not to be just taken solo for you to go out on some hilltop and go, I'll just figure all this out. God has given you pastors and shepherds and elders and teachers and people gifted in that to explain and unpack. And my goal on Wednesday nights is to help equip you guys, kind of some stuff we can't do on Sunday, to equip you guys to go, okay, I have a good understanding of this. So if somebody throws something goofy out, you're like, hold on now, like, let me check that. Or if it sounds really weird, like you're like, I need to pull back. So recommended Bibles. Now the LSB, I said the ESV, the Legacy Standard Bible is a new translation that has come out. It is heavily recommended by a lot of guys that Josh and I run in the same theological circles. John MacArthur, huge proponent. Josh Bice, the guy that runs G3 Ministries. Yes, it really is an update of the New American Standard Bible. But it is a good one. It is a good one. I have a copy in the back if anybody wants to look at it. Yes.
I've been reading a Bible called
The
the Pastor's Study
Pastor's?
Study Bible.
Okay.
It's an amp,
Never heard of it. Yeah.
but that's what it's called. And
Okay.
it's been
Really?
now.
Okay.
I'll show you what I'm talking about. There is.
So you,
Right here, you have the study books,
okay.
and it'll tell you, and you can tap on any of those. But this one right here will give you a background.
On your app, on the app. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, like I said, I mean, that may be a good one. I've never heard of it. Just because I've never heard of it doesn't mean it's not good. I don't know. I mean, a lot of that would be, who are the scholars that translated it? And like, there are probably 10 or 15 texts. If you just said, Will, how would I know? I would say, go to these 10 or 15 texts and see how that compares to a solid text,
Well, and that is
if that makes sense.
not that question.
Right.
Answer everything. Help me out.
Well, and it's not helpful if you're reading and don't understand stuff. That's why a study Bible's good, that has a good group of commentators that like are rooted and grounded. Slowly stuff starts to slip in. I'll give you some examples right quick. So NASB, great translation. ESV, good translation. Updates have been done to all of those. 120 scholars on the ESV, 50 plus scholars for 25,000 hours of research and translations to come up with the NASB in 71. Like I said, a little more difficult to read, but the ESV, the team that did that actually bought the rights to the RSV, which was the Revised Standard Version. They were like, we need a better translation. This team got together in 2001 and were like, we need a better translation. This could be the translation that could be on the table for a very long time in the States and English-speaking countries. So the ESV is kind of why I like that, and I preach on that. You guys, I mean, has anybody ever heard me preach on Sunday and go, I have no clue what that text is saying? Obviously, we're going to unpack the text, but it's a good job between readability and literal translation as best we can have. The NIV. Let me talk about the NIV for just a second. So the NIV in 1978 they come out with it. 84 in 2011 there's some updates. There's 100 scholars on that, and one of the great strengths of it is the readability. It's just very easy to read. A weakness of the NIV is they kind of delve into, and when I say thought for thought stuff, dabbles into interpretation rather than translation. Does that make sense? So they're more worried about interpreting it clearly rather than translating it as best they can. So they have a different agenda or a goal in mind. It's not necessarily wrong or wicked. It's just how they're doing it. Now, in 2011, I want to just note this. In 2011, the NIV, if you have an NIV 2011 or newer, they made revisions in regards to gender. So instead of man or woman, they would use the word person. Daughter or son would be child, and like he or she would be they. Now, they did not do it, from what I understand, in a malicious way to jump on well, I don't know. Now with God, they didn't change any of the masculine there. Jesus is he. All of that's clear.
So basically, they were jumping on the wagon.
Well, not necessarily. So like when, that was a little early for that. So for example, I was trying to think of an example, Josh. Correct. Now, So when he says, brothers, brethren, I urge you, in light of God's mercy, be reconciled to God. So we have phrases like that. Now, in the New Testament, in that language, when somebody said brothers, it wasn't like he was excluding ladies from it, but that's the masculine term used in the Scriptures. So when you say brothers and sisters, it's not necessarily wrong, but you're trying to add something to be inclusive to, that people don't think that it's just talking to men. Yeah.
So when I got to ask him about it, he said God conceptualizes himself.
Yes.
So that's where we're at.
Yes. That is how God relates to man, as Father and He.
Female, but he conceptualizes himself and
Yes.
Jesus.
Right.
Male right now, he's at the right hand of God physically.
Yes. Yes.
Or are they just trying to make
Well, so for instance, you guys remember when Jesus fed the 5,000? Remember that? So when you study that text, the only people who would have been counted historically were who? The men. So when you say Jesus fed 5,000, really, because you look at men, women, children, and people that were there, you're not talking 5,000. You're talking probably 15 or 20,000. So it's different when you read something and go, okay, I'm reading that, but you understand the context. When you study, you go, okay, they were only counting, like that was just what they were using. So there's a lot of like explanation that can be explained in that. So they're just like, look, if they talk about men, or we're just going to say brothers and sisters, or they. It wasn't a transgender trying to jump on the bandwagon. It was people are reading the Bible going, so the women just not included in that? Like God made man in His image, so He didn't make woman in His image? Well, no, that's not true. Mankind. We're just referencing that. Mankind is sinful. Man is sinful. When I say man is sinful, I mean everybody's sinful. It's just an inclusive term, if that makes sense. So they tried to kind of change that. So just be mindful in the NIV. They did that 2011 and up. So I just wanted people to kind of just be aware of that. That may not necessarily affect you wanting to read the text, if that makes sense. But it is something I think that is just worth noting. So let me just give you right quick. Let me just give you a few examples. So I'm going to read just a few passages. I'm going to read one from the NASB, the ESV, the NLT, and the Message. So we're just going to kind of go from this end of the spectrum. So 1, 2, NLT, the Message. I'm just going to read the same text. Romans 12, 1. You can flip there if you want to. Romans chapter 12, verse 1. In the NASB, I will read that first. Now, this I think is the 1995 and earlier version. They make one that's newer, but this is the one that Romans 12, verse 1. So Romans 12, 1 in the NASB. So the most literal NASB says this: Therefore, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. Okay? So that's more word for word. That may not be as choppy. Now, that's the NASB. That's like a 1995 or pre-1995. That's the one that most guys read. Now, there's a newer one, I think, that says brothers and sisters in it, doesn't. The newest one does say brothers and sisters in it. So there's another thing just. Okay, the LSB. What is that? What is LSB? You have, would you, Josh? Okay, so the LSB, Josh said, is the updated version to the 1995 NASB. Okay, so the ESV says this. So you read the Romans 12:1 NASB. ESV is this: I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. A little smoother, right? Same thing, a little bit smoother, not quite as kind of jerky, but it's smoother. And it's still, like I said, very close word for word, but a little bit. Yes, yes. And it will even reference the note at the bottom of footnote, brothers and sisters as well. But, like I said, what is their goal? To present the text as faithful as it can be from the original. So, the New Living Translation, NLT, Romans 12:1, again. And so, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all He has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind He will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship Him. You see what I'm saying? So it gets, oh, okay. That may be the way that you would just kind of explain it to somebody on the street, right? You just tell somebody. You may explain to somebody that. Now, is it wrong to explain to somebody that? No, not at all, if that makes it more clear. But if somebody told me, hey, the Apostle Paul, Luke, the physician Luke, the Apostle Peter, they wrote this letter, I'm going, what? Man, I want to be as close as to what they said as I can be. And then after we've said that, then we can work our way to unpacking what's being said, rather than kind of the unpacking being done for you. I do think this, and Josh may have made reference to it, it creates almost a, if this is all you read is these things, it kind of creates there's no real digging and searching. You just kind of read it and kind of go on, but I want those words to be impactful. And so NLT, as you saw, so here's the message, okay? So the message is going to be the most to the right, the paraphrase. So here's what I want you to do. God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for Him. So you see the looseness of that's all the same verse, right? It's all the same. Now, if I read the NASB and read the Message, I'd be like, okay, like I kind of see what you did, but that may be something that you would tell your kids. Hey, every part of your life, whatever you're doing, going to school, working outside, helping dad, cooking with mom, cutting the grass, like we want to do all those things as if we're serving the Lord, right? Well, and like I said, I just, and with Kate, like we read the ESV to Kate. We read the ESV. Listen, if the quicker you can get your kids to reading the literal thing, because what will happen is this, y'all, if your youth group, if all they're reading is the Message, they're going to be, they're getting a paraphrase of that. Now listen to this. You could read, pull up John 3:16 in the Message right quick. Somebody pull it up. I don't even have it. I just was going to pull it up right quick. You could pick up the Message Bible, right? If you had no understanding of any translation, right? You just brand new, and you just picked it up. Somebody could read a text in the Gospels and see what? That Jesus died for sinners. Come to Christ. Laura, you got it?
Yeah.
Okay, John 3:16.
John 3:16. This is how much God loved the world. He gave His Son. This is why, so that no one need be destroyed.
Right, and so I mean, a whole and lasting life. I mean, there's nothing about eternity. No. There's nothing there. So even there. So I never read that verse. But if you read that on Sunday and say that, do you see the confusion that takes place? Wow. So listen, what Paul wrote, what John wrote, what the gospel writers wrote, they are not trying to go, hey, let's be as vague as we can. Because that is very specific in the Greek. And anybody that knew Koine Greek was like, oh, geez. It may not make sense to us because we won't speak it, but to them it was like, absolutely. So you see why it's important what we read and what we teach our kids. So in another text, maybe a proverb or something more like whatever. You got the Beatitudes pulled up? Okay, yeah. Read a few right quick.
You're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. With less of you, there is more of God in His rule.
Okay.
You're blessed when you feel you've lost what is most to you. Only then can you be embraced by the one most. Blessed when you're content with just who you are, no more, no less. That's the moment you find yourselves proud owners of everything that can't be.
Okay, all right. Okay, all right. So if you're listening, just avoid the message completely. And here's the thing too, y'all. That sounds like, what that sounds like is almost like a very watered down kid's story of just trying to explain something. Look at me. Listen, you got kids, grandkids, whatever. Do not be afraid to read them the scriptures and allow the Spirit of God to do the work. You can explain it and unpack it. We will talk about this Sunday as we talk about the resurrection and what was accomplished. We will talk about, y'all, these big words we're talking about just happened to coincide tonight. We will talk about what it means for propitiation to have happened, what it means for justifications to have happened, what it means that our sanctification is being accomplished, and what it means that our future glorification will happen. Those are all good things to talk about. So there's no reason to water things down. So, like I said, a mature Christian, I think, can maybe use some of these and go, okay, let me see, whatever, I'm comparing it to this, but be very mindful that these Bibles are meant to be easy to read, the easiness. And I think in our culture, that has become a huge pitfall, is we want things to be easy, microwave, nuked, real fast, instant this, and I think let's do the hard work. And one of the reasons we have the class on how to study the Bible is so that you can have tools to walk through it and you don't feel lonely. And you can always ask me, Josh, elders, somebody. You can always ask somebody. You can always talk to somebody and go, hey, I'm trying to figure this out. Or I heard this said, I'm trying to make sure this is clear, or is this biblical? So please don't hesitate to do that. So, yes. CJ, right quick, what you got?
I have the NIV version of Romans 12:1.
Okay, what does the NIV say?
It says, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in God's mercy, to offer the body as a living sacrifice, pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship.
Yeah. Okay. Not bad.
I don't know what version that one is.
Right. That's not a bad version necessarily at all. So right quickly, recommended. NASB, 1995 or earlier. ESV, highly recommend that. The LSB is a really good translation. Even the New King James, y'all, not a bad translation, to be honest, kind of on that spectrum. The Amplified is a help study tool. It's literal, but also has the brackets to kind of explain stuff, not unhelpful. Things to avoid. NIV, 2011 plus, I'd probably just stay away from it. If you read it, it's not that that's not inclusive. It's just, if you start there, where do they start moving other things? The TNIV, the TNIV is be mindful about today's NIV. Be mindful about that. They do some of the gender things as well, and maybe a little bit more looser with the translation. I would avoid those. The NWT, the New World Translation, I had a kid come up to me. This has been years ago. He walked up. He was in youth group in Opelika. He was with our youth guy. He came in. He's like, hey, man, I got a brand new Bible. This guy gave me one at school. It was an NWT, a New World Translation. I was like, man, what in the world? I had really not heard about that. I had no real experience with Jehovah's Witnesses. But this is the NWT, the New World Translation, is a Jehovah's Witness Bible. Like they have translated, as Josh said, there's 5 guys that did it. Let me just give you one example. This is super heretical. John 1:1 in the ESV, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word what? Was God. New World Translation, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. Lowercase g. I just want you to, it's subtle. And the kid was like, I got this Bible. It's a really nice looking Bible. But absolutely twisted and contorted to fit their theology. Be mindful about that. And then the TPT, which is the Passion Translation, it's really, really goofy. The guy does some odd things. I read a couple excerpts out of it. I just was looking for some things that were weird. BibleGateway.com doesn't even have this on their translation. That tells you how bad it is. And then the NRSVUE, the New Revised Standard Version, Updated Edition. This is what Josh was referencing in regards to homosexuality. Churches like the United Methodist Church are bridging over to this Bible. Why? Because it fits their secular worldview as far as homosexuality goes. In the ESV, we have this in 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 11. It says, do not be deceived, neither the sexually immoral, nor the idolaters, nor the adulterers, nor men who practice homosexuality, right? ESV makes it very clear, right? And I think there's obviously a difference between if somebody struggles, right, with same-sex attraction, right? If they battle that. There are people that battle with opposite sex attraction, and they die to that and they kill it. That's the difference. In the NRSVU, it says, do not be deceived. The sexually immoral, which is very broad for them, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, or men who engage in illicit sex. So instead of homosexuality, which would just be pretty broad, they say men who engage in illicit sex. Like as if it's illegal, or like you could do that as long as it's not forced or paid for. So do you see how they break that down? So if somebody's reading this, they go, whew, I'm in a monogamous relationship and I was married by the justice of the peace, so what? I'm good to go. Still okay, still a part of God's kingdom, I can roll with that. That's a huge problem, right? So they're removing those things around. They use the same translation. They use the same translation in 1 Timothy 1, 8 through 11. They say the sexually immoral and men who practice homosexuality. That's in the ESV. The NRSV says the sexually immoral and men who engage in illicit sex. So they changed the homosexual translation to men who engage in illicit sex. Like just very, very different understandings. Now, Josh referenced the word. Josh, the word, how you pronounce it? Arsenokoites. So Paul, most people believe that Paul coined that phrase in Greek. It's not seen anywhere else until he coins it in 1 Corinthians 6. Yes. So Leviticus 18 and 20, he references two Hebrew words and kind of goes, this is what we'll say about men who practice homosexuality, who engage in this type of behavior. And also, too, like in regards to homosexuality, just so we're clear, if you're lusting and desiring that all the time but simply not acting on it, it's still a sin. Does that make sense? I just want us to understand that, too. Like if you're not murdering somebody but you're always thinking about murdering them, that's a problem. So what I mean by not practicing is people that are fleeing, repenting, actively running away from and turning from that brokenness, either in thought or desire or action. So that's the difference, just so we're clear. But yes, those are just two really broken, it's a really broken interpretation. No one really disagrees that say it again, Josh? Arsenokoites. He says it so smoothly. That's a debatable thing about homosexuality. So just be aware of these other trends. Listen, there are probably tons of other ones to avoid, to be honest with you. I just wanted to list a few and give you some good recommendations. So you can't really go wrong with reading a more literal word-for-word translation. That's what we teach from. That's what we preach from. You won't probably ever see me with any other thing in my hand necessarily. When I study, though, do I look at some other translations to see the phrasing and the wording? Yeah, I do that for sure. But I'm always going back to what is the most word-for-word thing in literal translation that I can get that is readable and would be beneficial for the body. So that's the goal. So thank you guys for tonight, and you guys watching on TV. If you're in town, join us this Sunday for Easter, Resurrection Sunday at 10 a.m. And our Good Friday service is Friday at 5 p.m. It's going to be really good. Josh and I are going to get some more stuff prepped for that. So be there at 5 o'clock for that service. It'll be really awesome and a different take and different style. So Friday at 5 and then Sunday at 10